Welcome to Doing the Work, a Naples integrated recovery podcast. My name is Brian, and this space is for anyone who's tired of surviving the same emotional and behavioral loops, whether that's anxiety, trauma, addiction, or problems in your relationships. Around here, we cut the surface level advice, no sugarcoating, no platitudes, no bumper sticker wisdom. We focus on clarity, responsibility, emotional discipline, and the courage to look at yourself honestly so that you can stop repeating the same old patterns and start living with intention instead of reaction. Let's get into it. Welcome back, listeners. I started with a new client doing some anger management work, which I really enjoy. And this client told me that he reads me or perceives me as being like very calm and unbotherable, all the adjectives that one would strive for. And I really find humor in that because compassion is not my default setting. If you have listened to the show, there are a lot of conversations about anger or processing anger. And I think that for me, often rage gets there first, but to not act out when upset, I think has been a learned skill. And so I wanted to share a few helpful interventions. No deep breathing exercises here today, but really some of the shaping experiences or literature that has kind of helped me cognitively find some shifts. I can move from calm to prosecutorial in about 2.5 seconds. There are a lot of episodes. Check out that one of me like losing my shit at Lowe's. I don't like scream at people, but I can, a prosecutorial harsh tone can come out where I start like rapid firing off questions that I know the answers to. And there's like a smugness in the questioning. And I hate that I do that. So I really try to be aware when my prosecutor has entered the room so that I can interrupt myself. But this comes online very fast when I see entitlement, incompetence in a person or a position where competence is required. If there is hypocrisy, bloated waste, or someone demanding respect that they have not earned. And if I see somebody create a mess or refuse accountability and then expects others to accommodate them, something inside of me starts building a case. I gather the evidence, I prepare the closing argument, I become invested in ensuring that the jury understands exactly who is guilty. And then I read a very brief story that I think really I needed to hear. It really shifted things for me. And so I want to read an excerpt from Jack Kornfield's book, The Wise Heart. It's short. And then I'm going to tie in some Stoicism and some other stuff, and then we'll go from there. So this comes from chapter 2, Holding the World in Kindness. And he writes, Alan Wallace, a leading Western teacher of Tibetan Buddhism, puts it like this. Imagine walking along the sidewalk with your arms full of groceries and someone roughly bumps into you so hard that you fall down and your groceries are strewn all over the ground. And as you rise up from the puddle of broken eggs and tomato juice, you are ready to shout out, "You idiot! What's wrong with you? Are you blind?" But just before you can catch your breath to speak, you see that the person who bumped into you actually is blind. And he too is sprawled in the spilled groceries, and your anger vanishes in an instant to be replaced with a sympathetic concern Are you hurt? Can I help you get up? And our situation is like that. When we clearly realize that the source of disharmony and misery in the world is ignorance, we can open the door to wisdom and compassion. So I'll cut that quote there, that way I don't get sued for reading too much of his book. But I really liked that, and it ties into another intervention that I've used for a long time in therapy. The Stoics predate Jack Kornfield by about 2,500 years. And in Epictetus's Discourses 1.18, and there's a past episode on this if you want more detail, but I'm just going to summarize Discourses 1.18, that we should not be angry with those who fall into error. And Epictetus argues that people act according to what appears right, useful, or desirable to them. And he makes the case that even the thief, liar, or adulterer believes that in that moment that the behavior will deliver something that is worth having. The problem sits in their judgment itself, that they have confused advantage with goodness, or impulse with necessity, and gratification with genuine self-interest, and they are choosing that through a distorted vision. So Epictetus says that a wrongdoer has already injured himself the most by damaging his own capacity for sound judgment and honorable choice. Now, that doesn't erase groceries from the pavement, especially with what groceries cost today, and it doesn't relieve anybody of responsibility of the collision, but it explains how someone can behave destructively while believing that his actions make sense. And Epictetus asks us to view this moral confusion with the same compassion that we would extend to somebody whose physical sight had failed. So there you go. The Stoics had it long before this book, and accountability is appropriate. It is required. Boundaries, consequences, confrontation, and removal may all be necessary. But rage loses some of its authority once we understand that the person creating the damage may be operating with compromised sight or blindness. And there's another Stoic that has something parallel about 500 years after. I'm just making up dates here, I think, now. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his personal journal, Meditations 2.1, he prepared himself every morning to meet meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, and antisocial people. And then he reminded himself that these qualities arise from ignorance. And he's telling himself that the people who are most likely to piss him off today are moving through the world without seeing clearly. Now, their blindness may require being addressed, but the practice is meeting that behavior with enough clarity that their confusion does not become his own. So this blindness frame I really like because it interrupts the fantasy that I can prosecute someone into developing capacities that they do not possess. I can identify harm, I can protect myself and others, I can set limits, change destructive behavior, and impose consequences. I can refuse to pretend that damage becomes acceptable just because someone has a limitation. But the internal shift concerns the energy that I bring to the response, that harsh prosecutorial tone that I can have if I don't catch myself first. And so with that, I can stop trying to crush a person into awareness and make decisions that are based on demonstrated capacity. And so with Kornfield's larger point, it is that compassion arises when we see the human condition clearly. Buddhist psychology understands suffering as a product of blindness, fear, trauma, craving, confusion, and disconnection from our deeper nature. And in this book, Jack Kornfield describes compassion as the heart responding to pain with tenderness and courage. So he uses the image of looking at suffering with kind eyes. And that phrase sounds like it's soft until you realize how fucking difficult it is when you have been knocked down and all your groceries are smashed all over the place, to then get up and then practice kindness. Kind eyes can still see the damage. You may have damaged groceries, you may have a scuffed knee and elbow, and they also see more than the damage. Most of us see behavior before we look at conditions that shape it. Now, I don't expect people to think and act like a therapist. And even as a therapist, if I get pissed off, often my first default is, I wonder what shaped this person's behavior, right? Because if I'm living from reactivity, then I'm probably missing that piece. But we see arrogance, and we miss that maybe underneath it there is fear. Or maybe you see passivity, and underneath it there was learned helplessness. Or if you see addiction, maybe you are missing the desperate attempt for that person to try to regulate pain. And I think that for rage, often it is a protective system that learned that aggression was safer than being vulnerable. Curiosity disappears the moment that moral certainty has taken over. The person becomes the offense, and then our own disgust can start feeling like evidence of our own goodness. And people come into therapy all the time carrying adaptations that once helped them to survive and now create suffering everywhere they go. Their defenses hurt their partners in arguments, their fears control their children, and their own shame turns into judgment about other people. Trauma can become rigidity, avoidance, domination, collapse, addiction, a whole bunch of maladaptive ways to respond to that. And a therapist has to see the cost clearly while trying to remain curious about how these patterns were built. Once curiosity disappears and moral judgment is in the seat, then treatment becomes punishment with clinical language wrapped around it. I just did an episode about a therapist influencer talking about his political ideology and how he would attack somebody who has a differing political belief. So I think it's important to look for the conditions that have shaped this person in front of you before you have taken some sort of a moral high ground. And this reminds me, when I was in grad school, part of practicum and learning when you're in internships is that you do group supervision with a instructor who's a licensed therapist and counselor educator. And a counseling student came in and wanted to process in the group. She was so excited to talk. Well, that's how I perceived it. She was just so ready to tell everybody about a bad client that she had. And she was a white student who described firing a white client who said the N-word in a session. And she said it with the supervision was around how personally injured she felt that he used that language. She terminated treatment with him, and I don't even know what this client's thing was that they were being seen for, but I remember thinking, what if you are firing a client for saying a word that you don't like or that triggers you? I think you are missing part of what the clinical work is supposed to be. Now, the language, somebody saying the N-word, for example, that requires a direct limit. You can absolutely stop and challenge and say, hey, you can't say things like that here, or, man, that word is really loaded. And I imagine that probably times that you have said that, there's probably been some consequences in your life? Or have you ever thought about like how that might impact somebody when you say something like that? And there needs to be curiosity about how did that word become normalized for you? That was just like a new thing that you said in conversation all the time, and that didn't like, set off an alarm for you, or what function it served, or anything like that. But to just fire a client because you took the moral high ground, like, hey, we don't say things like that here, you're fired. Like, once moral disgust has become the formulation, how are you planning to help this person? Compassion asks us to remain present long enough to understand the conditions that formed what is in front of you. Now, I'm not saying or pretending that that is easy to do. So, for example, if you have a word or a certain thing that really pisses you off, like, be aware of some of your own cues and triggers so that when that trigger is activated, that you have enough of a pause that you can respond with clarity from your values, how you want to respond in that moment instead of react. Compassion asks us to recognize blindness while protecting ourselves and others from the damage that blindness can cause. A person can be deeply impaired, morally responsible, and at the same time wounded and dangerous and redeemable and limited all at once. And rage wants a cleaner, faster category. The human nervous system loves a villain because a villain eliminates ambiguity, and we are just not wired for ambiguity. So compassion keeps the whole person in view, including the harm that they are causing. This is where I think the practice is difficult, because if I can remember this blind man's story, it creates compassion if I remember it. And I have to remember it constantly because rage arrives first. So the practice begins with one question: would I be this angry if I understood the depth of the person's blindness? The question does not erase having spilled groceries, but it helps me to decide what to do next without turning every collision into a trial. Now, Kornfield's chapter moves from compassion toward other people into the harder territory of compassion towards ourselves. Many of us can understand another person's pain long before we can offer any mercy to our own. In some cases, we can understand or explain somebody else's addiction or fear or rage with impressive sophistication while treating our own suffering as evidence of weakness or selfishness or moral failure. Which is one of the reasons that I'm kind of critical of character defect type language. And Kornfield describes in this book, he was an American who entered monastic life with pain that he managed to bury from childhood violence, unworthiness, self-doubt, and a deep internal struggle to feel loved. He lived in a forest monastery, and the discipline there brought all of that closer to the surface, because his first response was work harder and become more disciplined. Ever hear any of that? Especially if somebody's gone to therapy for years, or to be more spiritual or more worthy. And the striving intensified the wound, because every difficult emotion became evidence that he still was not good enough. And he wrote about how eventually he learned that unworthiness cannot be healed through more and more force. Now that lands hard for me, because I entered recovery already hating myself, and I mean fucking self-hatred. I couldn't even look at the mirror without disgust. I hated my body. I hated what addiction had done to my life. I hated my decisions. I hated my failures, and I just hated the person that I had become. I felt haunted by myself, and telling somebody to work a program harder or to make better choices or be more disciplined or to look for your character flaws does not deliver kindness to the kind of shame that somebody is carrying like that. Shame can use every spiritual instruction as another fucking weapon. And so this is why I have found Buddhism to be a gentler approach than some of the shaming language that I experienced in 12-step recovery. Other people may have different experiences, and obviously there's a whole variety of people there. Not everybody is shaming, but so AA gives language for people who don't have a grad school vocabulary of these internal systems. But something that is challenging for me or off-putting for me about an AA approach is that self is presented as the center of all problems. Self-seeking, self-pity, self-centered, selfish, self. And the solution is self-abandonment. And for years, I just regurgitated this language because that's what my sponsor wanted me to do, or that's how I would get the strokes that I was being a good little AA. And believing that that's what recovery required for me was abandoning myself because I'm the enemy. My own thinking got me here. And when I challenged parts of that framework, the challenge became proof to some of my peers in AA that I was so full of self. If you are in line and agreeing, then you're showing that you're willing. And if you disagree, then you are showing how sick you are. And if that frame works for you, great, use it. I find that off-putting. Now, there are some interventions in there that can be helpful. So AA has what they call the sick man's prayer. And that can help somebody loosen some resentment and can interrupt a rage part. So this sick man's prayer is asking God or the universe or however you conceptualize a higher power to help view this person through a lens of, this is a sick person. Or kind of going back to the beginning of the episode, this is a blind person. Am I really going to be angry at a blind person for accidentally bumping into me? Now, these two approaches sound very similar, but I think that where 12-step deviates and makes this more challenging is that in a 12-step character defect shaming approach, anger is often pathologized and continued exposure gets praised as forgiveness, and accountability disappears while the injured person inventories their reaction. Now, that something missing from that program is boundaries. To my knowledge, I don't think that's anywhere in the big book, and that's kind of an important part of this kind of work. Now, I get that this was written nearly 100 years ago before there was like a lot of different types of therapy, but this approach becomes very dangerous for people who have already been trained to abandon themselves, tolerate abuse, or believe that their needs are inherently selfish. Kornfield addresses in this chapter, or somewhere around there, the wound that is beneath most of this is a problem of self-hatred. And he described a meeting between some Western Buddhist teachers and the Dalai Lama, where the teachers were raising the prevalence in the West, in the United States, of shame, unworthiness, and self-criticism among their students. And the Dalai Lama did not even understand the concept. It had to be translated and explained to him. And then once he grasped what they meant, he was surprised because from his perspective, every human being possesses inherent preciousness. And the Western teachers were describing people who had learned to experience their own existence as a defect. So reading this was profoundly different from my previous 12-step only approach. So I encourage people that if this 12-step approach is all that you need, then let it stop there. But I work with a lot of clients who need therapy for the areas that the 12 steps do not cover. And the 12 steps are a great guide for arresting addiction and helping somebody live life on life's terms. But I think that some of these are real helpful adjuncts. And so this chapter from Kornfield was a lot closer to my experience than this idea that my self needed to be dismantled, and helped me understand why the language of self-erasure landed so destructively for me, or was so hard for me when trying to work with a sponsor in AA, and why IFS, internal family systems, for example, gave me another framework. Because IFS separates self is a person's innate, undamaged core and natural internal leader. And IFS posits that this exists in everyone and remains inherently whole despite trauma and addiction and shame and other experiences. So those would be parts that can surround self, and those parts can be addiction or rage or shame, fear, disgust, all those things. So we've all got lots of parts. I'm not going to make this an IFS episode, but those parts had histories and jobs, and in my experience, they had learned to protect me through strategies that eventually became destructive, and they required leadership and care that came from self rather than further contempt and self-abandonment. So IFS challenges the assumption that self means selfishness, and in that model, self is somebody's capacity that becomes available when the protective parts no longer have to run the whole system. And he uses 8 C's to describe what the self is. I can't remember what they are, but it's like calm, curious, compassionate, creative, connected, CCCC. Look them up if you want to, but that's IFS. And those qualities resemble that deeper nature that I think Kornfield is describing. Self-compassion becomes possible when we stop treating every painful part as an enemy that needs to be conquered. Now, my early recovery sponsor offered a form of tenderness. He gave me a lot of time when I had no idea how to navigate recovery. This guy met with me every week to go through the big book when I didn't know my ass from my elbow. And eventually we went in different directions, and the ending did not erase that foundation that he helped me build at the beginning. So I am very grateful for that. And his time communicated that I was worth helping before I believed that I was worth helping. And he gave me enough acceptance to tolerate the truth without drowning in it. I grew up in a pretty conservative Pentecostal Christian church, and I cannot easily identify a ton of people there who radiated consistent non-judgment and love. I'm sure that they probably exist somewhere, but going to AA meetings was one of the first places where I had met people who often were non-judging. Some of the vulnerable shares that came from there allowed me to drop my guard enough to know that I was among other people who were kind of going through some of the same challenges as me, or had worked through many of the same challenges as me. And in the same rooms, you can also find some of the same people that may reproduce the same rigidity, shame, hierarchy, and hypocrisy that you find in religion. I can recall before even stopping drinking, a crusty old timer who cross-talked, which is where you tell somebody else in the room, you give somebody else instructions, which you're not supposed to do that in a 12-step program. Now, I'm not even sober at this point, and this guy says, if I tell you to strip down naked and push a quarter down the side of the road, nose first, you do it to stay sober. And I remember thinking, I would rather fucking die in a ditch than ever come back to this room or work with these people or do any of these things. So there's a lot of sick people that may even be sober for 20 or 30 years and saying things like that. So humiliation rarely produces honesty. Usually it produces better hiding. And that may be one of compassion's simplest forms. Someone sees what is wounded, confused, and unfinished in you and stays long enough for you to start seeing yourself differently. The pain remains real, accountability remains necessary, and the person is still asked to grow. Compassion gives them the place where growth can become possible. For someone that is organized around self-hatred, that place can be the difference between confronting the truth and then using the truth as another reason to disappear. So naturally, this conversation leads us to compassion's most demanding territory, which is courage to have the hard conversation, limits, and action. A compassionate life does not require taking responsibility for every wounded person, tolerating abuse, or rescuing people from consequences, or surrendering your own self-respect. Compassion includes the suffering person, the people who are being harmed, and the part of us that is responsible for protecting our own life. Once anyone is excluded from that circle, compassion becomes distorted. So, Kornfield describes compassion as having both a yes and a no. The yes recognizes suffering, dignity, and a person's possibility that they can change. The no confronts the abuse, the exploitation, the violence, addiction, or behaviors that are damaging people who are involved. And Buddhist traditions describe this as fierce compassion, that fierceness serving protection and awakening, and it aims to stop harm while refusing to let hatred be the thing that is driving that. And that distinction, I think, is important because my natural corrective energy, when it's prosecutorial, isn't always helpful. Now, I can recognize a problem quickly. Oh, yes. Organize evidence, expose contradictions, and sometimes sharply deliver a response that is designed to leave no room for escape other than I have confronted you with the truth. And sometimes that direct confrontation is necessary with addictions after I have earned the place to do that. The danger appears when the goals shift from correcting behavior to making somebody feel the weight of my judgment. And at that point, now I am kind of shaping punishment around anger instead of shaping an intervention that actually could help somebody. And going back to the Stoics, they understood correction as part of responsibility to each other. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself that people are behaving badly through ignorance about what is genuinely good, useful, and honorable. And he believed that human beings should be instructing, challenging, redirecting, and sometimes distancing themselves from destructive behavior. That correction needs to come from concern for shared humanity or shared community, because contempt poisons the person that is delivering it, and it rarely teaches the person who is receiving it. So I'm going to leave you with a Naples Integrated homework assignment. 3 questions before acting. The first question is, what blindness might be operating here? And this asks about a person's capacity, conditioning, fear, trauma, ignorance, entitlement, or limitations that a person might not even be able to see. Curiosity shows us where change might be possible, where external structure is required, and where waiting for insight has probably become its own form of denial. The second question is, what harm needs to be challenged? Because blindness does not make the collision harmless. Someone still has to pick up the fucking groceries. Racism injures people. Addiction destabilizes families. Incompetence wastes money. It creates risk. It pisses me the fuck off. Hypocrisy corrodes trust. The question requires us to name the behavior, identify the impact, establish the limit, and then allow appropriate consequences to occur. People who are trained to abandon themselves often experience a boundary as cruelty. They keep granting access, time, money, labor, forgiveness, and emotional energy long after the arrangement has become destructive. Kornfield described compassion as a circle that includes everybody, including you. You belong in the circle. Your well-being does not become expendable because another person is wounded. The third question is, what response serves repair rather than my urge to prosecute? Repair may involve a direct conversation, a written boundary, a financial consequence, maybe ending a relationship, reporting misconduct, refusing further access, or even stepping away permanently and closing the door forever. Kindness does not require a warm tone or continued friendship. It requires that the response fits the harm and serves something larger than your own emotional retaliation. Sometimes the most compassionate response is a clear no delivered without degradation. In practice, these questions may happen within seconds. I notice myself building a case, let's say. I identify the blindness. I determine what the damage requires, and then I ask whether the response will protect something, repair something, teach something, or simply punish the other person and make them hurt because I am hurting. And that last possibility is the one that rage likes to hide in. Punishment feels righteous when I call it accountability, and my certainty makes that disguise a heck of a lot easier for it to maintain. The work, at least for Brian, is that rage will often probably continue to reach the scene faster than my compassion does, and my ongoing work is to keep it from appointing itself as the judge, jury, and executioner. The blind man on the sidewalk gives me a way back. I really liked that teaching, understanding blindness, challenging harm, choosing a consequence that serves protection rather than revenge. In some cases, the groceries are still broken. Somebody's got to clean the tomato sauce out of my Amazon floral that I bought. I can name the damage. I can require accountability, protect myself from the next collision, and then comes the harder part. Leave the sidewalk. Compassion allows me to pick up what's mine and keep walking before another person's blindness becomes the place where I live. and that is doing some work on anger. Thanks for listening. Thanks for spending the time with me. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with somebody who may need to hear it. Be kind to yourself, be kind to people around you. Remember that we're all doing the best that we can with the tools that we currently have, and we're all capable of growing past that. If you'd like to reach out or connect, send me an email, brian@naplesintegratedrecovery.com. I hope to hear from you there. In the meantime, thanks again for listening. I'll see you on the next one.